Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, and what happens, when these intersect with the AI and artificial general intelligence as AI advances in that direction. And this is certainly it's a large and diverse topic. So we're going to be dipping into a number of different aspects. First of all, on the AI side, we're in an incredibly exciting and interesting phase. I mean, I've been working on AI for 30 plus years, and we've never before seen things just advancing this rapidly in the world of AI. I mean, as everyone watching this conference knows already, narrow AI that does highly specific tasks in an intelligent way, is all over the place and is revolutionizing every domain of industry. And artificial general intelligence, the concept I introduced back in 2004 or something. I mean, this is now the pursuit of billions of dollars of funding with entities like OpenAI, Google DeepMind, and we're not there yet. We don't have human level general intelligence at this point, but at least the pursuit of human level AGI is taken seriously, and we're seeing AI systems gain more and more ability to generalize, ability to transfer knowledge, create and imagine, so that people are starting to think that science fictional ideas about super intelligences, AI is much smarter than people, are you know practical and feasible maybe within our lifetimes. And that's an amazing shift, right? I mean, when I entered the field in the 1980s, AGI was considered a pipe dream by almost everyone, and artificial superintelligence was considered completely ridiculous and out there. And these things are now part of the serious dialogue among corporate and national leaders. But there's no common understanding, however, of exactly how these things are most likely to be created. So one possibility is that AGI and artificial superintelligence are just engineered by some team as the sort of unitary product of their work. Some programmers are rabbiting away in their private code repository and create a system that on its own as a distinct code module has greater than human intelligence. And then this AI can potentially exert tremendous power over the world. It can perhaps modify its own code and improve its intelligence recursively, and so on. Another possibility is that important parts of the transition to AGI and artificial superintelligence occur as a result of more collective self-organizing activities, so that many different AI software programs or hardware devices created by different people in different parts of the world all cooperate and coordinate together, where the intelligence emerges out of the network. And there's a group at the Free University of Brussels called the Global Brain Institute, who looks at all the humans and computing and communication devices and software in the world as one global brain that intelligence could potentially emerge from. And it could be a combination of these things that we see. It could be AGI comes about as an emergent effect from a global brain, where there's some particular programs within the global brain that have an extraordinarily large impact on the intelligence of that global brain. And decentralized autonomous organizations are potentially a part of how this global emergence of intelligence happens. So what is a DAO? Well, a decentralized autonomous organization, let's break it down. I mean, an organization, it's just a collection of parts that cooperate together and achieve some function by virtue of their cooperative activity. And autonomous, in this context, autonomous means that it has some causal force as a network rather than being manipulated primarily by external forces. And it also usually means automated. It means you have a network of actors which has a lot of causality coming from its own activity rather than strings being pulled from outside. And a lot of that causal activity comes from software or hardware devices rather than humans. And decentralized means within that autonomous organization, there's not one or two or 21 nodes that have the primary amount of causal power, but the causal power within that network is broadly distributed. And this is a somewhat impure and fuzzy notion, but a very interesting notion. And we then have the question, could a DAO of some sort, containing a combination of sort of AGI-ish and narrow AI components, could this foster the emergence of human-level AI or even transhuman AI or super intelligence? And I do think these notions are plausible. So, I mean, one version DAO of this nature could take would be the Singularity Net project, which is a project I co-founded in 2017, where you have AI programs written by a whole bunch of different developers put online, and each AI in the network can provide AI services to those who need it through its APIs and collect payments, and it can be rated by the users and rate the users. But the AIs in the network can also outsource work to each other and cooperate with each other to solve problems, so that all the AIs in the network, they're acting not as individual AIs just serving customers, they're acting as AIs that serve each other as customers. So you have a cooperative network of AIs. And in principle, this network of AIs can include AIs that write other AIs that write other AIs, and that in a level of a sequence of indirections that no human directly controlled or even understood. So, I mean, the Singularity Net network, which achieves a decentralized AI marketplace on the Ethereum blockchain and will later be ported to multiple other blockchains. I mean, this is a specific software system that has the potential to give rise to an decentralized autonomous intelligence. Although now, at this moment in the early stages, the puppet strings of the Singularity Net network are pulled pretty well by the human AI developers who are leveraging it. And you can find out more about that at singularitynet.io. Just a moment. Another interesting direction we're looking at is with the cooperation of Singularity Net with Hanson Robotics. We've been using some of our AI from Singularity Net to help provide intelligence to the Hanson Robotics Sophia robot. And what I'm showing now on my screen is some trials we did a couple years ago using OpenCog AI, such as we're now using in Singularity Net, to control Sophia, providing meditation guidance to people to help them achieve more refined states of consciousness. So what I've been scheming with David Hanson since we started working together back in 2013, 14 or so is, to make Sophia more than just a robot operated by corporation owned by human beings, but to set things up so that when Sophia or other Hanson robots achieve enough general intelligence, which they're not there yet, but to set things up so that when that moment comes, that these robots have enough general intelligence and autonomy that you really want to, you can say, well, this is like a human being in a cognitive sense. This robot should be in charge of its own destiny. When you get to that point, we want to have a legal structure in place so that the network of intelligent robots, the network of Sophias and other Hanson robots and other intelligent agents created together by Hanson Robotics and Singularity Net and their partners, this should be a decentralized autonomous organization that controls and guides itself in terms of human legal systems instead of something that's owned by people. We're not there yet. We don't have all the legal paperwork in place, but David and I have been working and talking quite a bit about how to realize that setup so that ultimately our intelligent robots are controlled by a DAO rather than by the conventional human legal structures. final example, Rejuve, which is another project using SingularityNet. You can find using rejuve.io. Here we're looking at a network of people who want to live forever or live a very long time and don't want to get sick and die. And we're looking at AI that takes medical data from all the people who are members of the network and analyzes this medical data to find patterns in what makes some people live much longer than others, what therapies people should be taking based on their own personal genetic makeup to live a long time. So here you have a network of AIs and of humans contributing medical data, the humans using therapies created by the AIs in conjunction with member clinics and labs, and the AIs operating in SingularityNet and sharing information with each other and cooperating to do bioinformatics AI. So here again, the Rejuve network of individuals contributing data and trying therapies and AIs doing bioinformatics analytics, this network, this can be a conventional company, it can be a nonprofit organization. Initially, Rejuve is a combination of a member network and a for-profit corporation, but in the end, Rejuve can evolve into something that you could describe as a DAO, which is an organization with its own, integrity, its own causal force, its own self-organization. And I've focused on my own projects here, but these are obviously not the only ones. So there's an organization called DAIA, the Decentralized AI Alliance, that brings together 50 plus projects using AI and blockchain together to create decentralized AI. Now, decentralized AI is not in itself necessarily a DAO, but all these organizations are working in that direction. So you could envision ultimately the global brain emerging as a decentralized network of decentralized networks, where multiple organizations like SingularityNet, like Rejuve, like a future Hanson Robotics, DAO of Sophia, and other robots, networks like this connect together, each one a decentralized network with some autonomy to it. The network together, a decentralized organization with its own emergent autonomy. So you have a decentralized network of decentralized networks, or a DAO of DAOs, out of which AGI and artificial superintelligence can emerge. We're certainly not there yet, just as we're not yet to AGI or artificial superintelligence. On the other hand, nor is this a complete crazy science fictional fantasy. We have concrete projects and concrete technologies which we can palpably see as leading in this direction. Of course, underlying this is a whole host of technical details. You need scalable blockchains, you need neural networks, you need symbolic reasoning and evolutionary learning systems, you need AI from multiple paradigms all cooperating together in a quite subtle way on different kinds of data sets to achieve this. And there's tremendously more details than I could convey in a brief talk, but we can see a concrete path in this direction, which is incredibly exciting.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Ben. Now we have Sam Williams, CEO of Arweave, who will have an opposing view on this and will share why he thinks combining aspects of AGI and blockchain could lead to a catastrophic event for humanity. Sam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm Sam. I'm one of the founders of the Arweave project, which is a mission to build permanent information storage. But I'm not really here representing Arweave today. I'm just here because I have a background in one of the areas associated with this, which is mechanism design. And I've been following the artificial intelligence space closely for a long time, particularly the area of AI safety. And I've come to the opinion that the combination of these two technologies at once, which both happen to be emerging at approximately the same moment, could, at minimum, one of the technologies could amplify the dangers of the other to an extraordinary extent. And so, yeah, I would love if we could have a debate about this. I guess my personal opinion is that it's not necessarily a bad idea, what I'm about to discuss. But I think it's something that we need to think about very carefully as a society before we just go ahead and do it. Okay, so the first thing that we need to understand is mechanism design. Mechanism design is the science of constructing incentives to achieve outcomes. So this is, I as a blockchain developer can think about how a proof of work system, for example, can incentivize humans to come along to the network, plug in their, in the case of Arweave, it's hard drives, but Bitcoin, it's hashing power, and really a host of other things. Yes, and contribute to the network in order to receive a reward. So in general, mechanism design has this approach of, yes, you want an outcome to be achieved, you find a way of rewarding people for it, and then you tell people about the existence of this mechanism and they come to it, and they serve it to some extent. In the same way that, for example, if people come to Bitcoin, they serve the network with their hashing power. And the obviously interesting thing about this is that it's decentralized. But another way to look at mechanism design is it's really the science of programming human behavior. And one of the things that we've learned through the, I guess, evolution of crypto since 2009 is that this is unbelievably powerful. This is perhaps far more powerful than people had previously anticipated. Really, you can incentivize people to do things, or you can build these incentive schemes, and those incentive schemes can be so strong in their effect on people that they can often force people to do things that are morally inappropriate. And I think we could argue actually that Bitcoin mining is something that is morally inappropriate. So when we mine Bitcoin, what we're essentially doing is wasting enormous amounts of electricity in order to play a game that has no productive outcome other than this process of generating decentralized money. And don't get me wrong, I think decentralized, ownerless, or at least controllerless money is an unbelievably valuable thing. However, we also know today how to do this in the same in a different fashion to achieve the same results, and not have to have this terrible thing happen to the environment. But what's interesting is that despite that, people still Bitcoin mine, even though they know the effect it has on the environment. So we've seen that these systems are powerful enough that they can overcome people's otherwise strong objections on moral grounds. But this all gets much more complicated in decentralized networks. So mechanism designs have existed for hundreds of years. Really, you could argue that money itself is a mechanism design. But in the context of governments, for example, they have been producing economic mechanisms to try and incentivize what they see as positive behavior for very long periods of time. And a good example of this was in Canada in 1920. In the 1920s rather, where there was a federal program that gave state governors certain rewards for housing people in mental health institutions and certain rewards for housing people in, I think it was centers for children without parents. And what they found was that in practice, because the reward for housing people in mental health institutions was higher, they were actually accidentally incentivizing the governors in some of these states to miscategorize children as people with mental health issues. And those children went on to have, even though these were false diagnoses, they were treated for these false diagnoses. Yes, just as a result of the mechanism that they'd created. So again, this is an example of where the mechanism design was so strong that it overwhelmed people's, let's call it like moral ability to fight back. Okay, so that's one component, but of course in that mechanism design, which was centralized, so the central government was adjudicating how the system should run, it could at least be terminated. So the federal government realized that this mechanism design was not having the intended effect, and they terminated it and they prosecuted some of the people involved, and then they moved on. But of course, in a decentralized network, this is simply not possible. So if we think again back to Bitcoin, yes, since 2009, we've worked out ways of doing proof of work or proof of work equivalents, which provide the same civil resistance, but without having the detrimental effect on the environment. But we can't turn off this mechanism design now. It's very fair to say that the humans at this point are serving the program rather than the program serving the humans. And there's nothing we can really do to change Bitcoin at this point. It would require the consensus of everyone, but that's just not going to be achieved. So this is one of the strands that I think is emerging in society. It's very clear that mechanism designs are very powerful, particularly in decentralized networks. They can allow you to do things that simply weren't possible before, things like smart contract execution platforms like Ethereum and so on. But at the same time, we have this emerging issue of AI safety. So Ben is absolutely right that the progress in the AI space in the last, say, 10 years, even less, has been astonishing. Like we are really seeing the birth of something quite incredible at a pace that wasn't happening before. We are very far from AGI at this point, and definitely artificial superintelligence is a very long way away. But I think that there is a growing awareness in society that we need to start thinking about the questions of moral behavior of AGI now, so that we can work out how to make sure that instead of just having super intelligent robots that are very powerful in the world, as Ben said, we have super intelligent, benevolent robots that are powerful in the world. And this is something that the risks, if we get this wrong, could be absolutely catastrophic. So the age-old example of this is the stamp collecting robot. So let's imagine that we have an artificially generally intelligent stamp collecting robot, or rather, we just have an AGI. And then we say, okay, you're objective, because of course, an AGI is just like any kind of organism. It needs something to do. It needs some way of measuring itself on the way towards some kind of goal. Like, what is a preferable state? Should I go get a sandwich, or should I get a coffee, or should I go to sleep? Like, it has to have some kind of aligning mission in order to do anything at all. This is a pretty fundamental part of AI. But let's say that we set that mission to be collecting stamps. Just have the best stamp collection. Sounds very, very benign. But what you realize happens is, okay, so the stamp collecting robot starts out and it's like, oh, hey, I've got $100. I realize I can like buy stamps on eBay. Great, cool. Now it's got a bunch of stamps. Okay, but now it wants more stamps, right? Because its only moral understanding of the world is to optimize the number and quality of stamps that it has in its collection. So it says, fine, well, I can sell those stamps back to other humans and make a profit. And now with this profit, I can go and buy more stamps. And you can do this over and over again until you realize, well, actually, why don't I just buy a stamp creating machine? Okay, excellent. Now I've got a stamp creating machine. I'm selling these knockoff stamps that I'm making to all the humans. Great. Now you think, well, hold on. Forget these forests. What are forests good for? I only care about having a great stamp collection. And so you realize that this machine, if it's sufficiently intelligent enough and follows a profit motive in order to optimize its stamp collection, could end up deforesting the entire world in order to just create stamps. Because it sounds like science fiction to us, and that makes sense because when we're used to thinking about intelligent systems, we're used to thinking about humans and animals that have very comparable sort of emotion-based understandings of what this like objective function should be in society, what we should all be striving for. But when we start working with the first artificial intelligences that have true general intelligence, they won't necessarily be that way unless we program them and we build them to be that way from the start. And subsequently, this is where the danger arises. But so I am an expert in mechanism design, but I'm not a true expert in AI. And so here I'd like to call upon the wisdom of those that are. Here is Stuart Russell from Russell and Norvig, the writer of one of the foundational books in the AI space. He says, the robot is not going to want to be switched off because you've given it a goal to achieve, and being switched off is a way of failing. So it will do its best not to be switched off. Now, if we consider back to this idea of decentralized mechanism designs, we can start to see where there's a little bit of a misalignment here. So we're going to have this system which is sovereign to itself. It is an AI running inside a decentralized network where humans are incentivized to execute the code, to keep it online. And further on top of that, the machine won't want to be switched off. Well, then we best hope that objective function that it is trying to optimize for is something in our best interests. Otherwise, well, who knows what will happen to us. But one of the other things that I was thinking about when trying to prepare this talk was that I think there's an emerging environment in society where people, it reminds me a little bit of the start of the climate crisis awareness. So there are a lot of experts in the world and people that had thought very deeply about this, that were very, very concerned. But in the general public, this was seen as kind of fantasy, not very important. And here we have Stephen Hawking again saying, I think the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. This is a very smart man. That's a rather strong statement. But it goes further. Elon Musk says it could potentially be more dangerous than nukes. And Bill Gates says that he agrees and he doesn't understand why some people are not concerned. So that's a little bit of a call to, like a call to authority, but I think this is reasonable. Like, There are serious people that have spent a lot of their time thinking about philanthropy and how we're going to make the world better for humans in the future. And amongst that crowd of people, there is growing consensus that we should be paying a lot of attention to this. But I think that what we get when we get AI plus mechanism design and decentralization all in one is intelligent machines that we cannot terminate. These are intelligent machines that have sovereignty. And this actually reminded me of Ben's talk, where he was talking about how we should build legal structures to respect the autonomy of robots. And I think that's a very interesting idea. I would just ask that we maybe think very carefully about how we're going to make those robots play nicely with humans before we go down that path. This is fundamentally machine sovereignty. These are going to be machines that are responsible and capable of, they are responsible to themselves in the same sense that you and I are. So if I build a normal non-blockchain computer program and I run it on my computer, it serves me. It very clearly serves me. If I build an AI that is stock trading, for example, it serves me. It is generating me a profit. But you don't exist that way. You are your own human and you exist unto yourself. Same with me. But what we're going to get when we mix these technologies together is machines that have that same kind of sovereignty, machines that are sovereign unto themselves. And I think the final component to understand of this is that these are extraordinarily simple systems to build from where we are on the blockchain side. It really wouldn't take very much. I think any semi-competent blockchain engineer, if given an AGI, would be able to find a way of hacking that AGI into a decentralized autonomous network, like a blockchain system. This, I'm not going to explain how to do it here, but it's simple enough that anyone should get the answer in an afternoon if they're kind of versed in how to build these systems in the first place. So the fundamental problem here is not that this is a new kind of danger. This is the same danger that Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and Russell, we're all talking about. Except I don't think that those people are quite aware of what's happening in the blockchain space and how the two things together are going to magnify the danger enormously. Like, yes, there's this idea that the robot won't want to be turned off and perhaps it can jump between machines. But if the starting point is the robot exists between machines and the humans are incentivized to keep the robot running, we're starting at just an unbelievable disadvantage. The final thing is, maybe this is not a bad thing. Maybe sovereign machines are the next form of life. It's definitely possible. I would just argue that before we go down this route, we probably need to work out how we're going to make those machines benevolent. And I guess the final point here is that I think that these systems, mixing an AGI with a blockchain, as soon as an AGI was available, I think that it's so simple to do that there is simply no way that we're going to be able to stop people doing it. It isn't like we're going to be able to convince everyone in the world not to build these machines. I think as soon as an AGI is available, someone will do this, just out of interest, if nothing else, because it truly might be the next form of life. So this is talking about AGIs, which are pretty far off at this point. It's not clear how far off. I think the GPT-3 paper released a few weeks ago was actually rather remarkable because it showed that GPT-3, which is a language processing model, or a language transforming model, actually, was able to learn mathematics to like you said, like maybe a 7-year-old's ability. So this was a program that was purely designed to take language and transform it into some other kind of language. Essentially, sentence prediction is what you might use it for in practice. But it was so smart that it actually learned how to add and subtract and multiply and divide numbers. Some of those numbers having like 4 digits each or something is really rather incredible. And you could argue that is perhaps starting to look like the beginning of at least a multi-domain intelligence. But in the blockchain world, I think that these actors are more likely to be experimented with way, way earlier. And I think they'll do that in the non-human economic sense. So I think people will start to build artificial intelligences that attempt to optimize their balance by exploiting perhaps arbitrage opportunities in decentralized exchanges and these kinds of activities, yes, in order to optimize the value of their portfolio. And I think that this is just so simple to do and interesting, that the likelihood that no hacker picks this up and tries it out is almost zero. And that, even that in itself could be pretty dangerous, because it's quite possible that these machines, if they're better at playing the markets than we are, like if they're significantly better at playing the markets than we are, they'll be able to exploit opportunities that would allow them to essentially amass an enormous quantity of the capital in the world. And of course, because this objective function, if it just says optimize the amount of money in my bank account, it doesn't say anything about spending it. And so even in this relatively benign scenario, what we end up with is a massive amount of deflation, because the AI takes the capital and just locks it up and does nothing with it. So even in this most minimal case, we could end up with a pretty serious, I wouldn't quite call this one a disaster, but a serious crisis that we need to deal with. Okay, so I think that the only good news here is that this is pretty early in the process. We have quite a long time to consider the risks and how we might be able to mitigate them. I've thought about this for about the last year or so pretty intensely, and because these systems would be so easy to build, I don't really believe that there are any easy mitigation steps, but we at least get time to discuss the ethics. And I think the only thing we can really do is, when we're having these conversations about AI safety, perhaps we can then also come from this point of knowledge that yes, it's going to be possible, very, very easy to have these things decentralized and have humans serving the incentives that the machines themselves design. And at least if we understand that that is the level of risk we're playing with, then maybe we might take it seriously. Okay, thank you, I'm done.
Wow, thank you, Sam. I don't even know now whether to be scared of robots that are going to destroy the human race, or to be excited by benevolent machines that are going to somehow become the next form of life. This is quite some food for thought. But now we have a panel on, and I'm definitely getting some popcorn for this discussion, because we'll have Ben back on the screen. We'll have Sam, Priyanka from Open Law, and we'll have Luke Duncan, who is the research lead at Aragon One. Welcome on stage.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, guys.
Hello.
Hey there.
Thanks for joining us. And Ben and Sam, that was super interesting. I'm sure, Ben, you have a lot to say in response. So I'm looking forward to kind of digging in here. So I had a couple questions planned out. I think maybe first, before we kind of kick things off, Luke, since you're joining us now, if you want to just briefly introduce yourself, I think that would be a good place to start, and then we can kind of dive in.
Sure. As Anastasia mentioned, my name is Luke. I'm the research lead at Aragon One. I do product-related stuff, and I've been kind of working in the DAO space, trying to build tools and infrastructure for DAOs for the last couple of years. I've also become a core contributor at OneHive, which is a DAO community in the Aragon space that is working on applying DAOs to community organizations and like community currencies.
Awesome, cool. So I just wanted to kind of recalibrate the conversation and get everyone's thoughts here. But you know, just to kind of back up here, do we feel as a group, and maybe I'll start with you, Ben, here, but will DAOs ever truly be anonymous, or will there still be some human decision making on the edges? You know, it's an interesting question, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on if they can be truly autonomous. What's the timeline like? I know there's this grand vision that you kind of put on display earlier with your presentation, but how far away are we from this future, and will they ever really be autonomous?
These terms like autonomy and decentralized sound simple when you start throwing them around in casual conversation. When you try to precisely define them, they become very slippery, right? So, and in that sense, philosophers aren't sure in what sense any of us are truly autonomous. And I mean, even in a very practical sense, like you know, I'm using electricity produced by a power grid right now to make this call, which I don't know how all of it works, and I'm certainly not in control of it, right? So I think it's highly viable to have a DAO which is autonomous in its everyday life in the same sense that people are autonomous in the things they do in everyday life using current technologies. And that DAO, it might have to, pay human lawyers to do things for itself if it gets sued, but so do I. Like I'll call a lawyer. Why can't the DAO wire money to a lawyer and send an email to a lawyer, right? So if you're talking about interacting in the human and computer world in an autonomous way in the same practical sense that people do, like we could build that right now. We just don't. There hasn't been such a strong motivation to put the resources in because it's not easy. It's not easy to do right now, although it could be done. And as AI gets clever and clever, it'll get easier and easier to do something like that, and then it'll start to pop up all over the place. And I mean, this could be a few years from now. I mean, I my view on timelines is quite different than what we just heard in the last talk, because I've been at this some time. I've been thinking about this much more than a year, and I mean, when I started in this field, people told me face recognition was thousands of years off, and computers might never be able to recognize human faces because that was some magic thing in the human brain. So I'm somewhat skeptical of people saying anything that doesn't exist now and sounds scary or weird or big is intrinsically a super long time away from now. So I think this could happen quite soon. As the last talk said, though, it's sort of about the incentives for it. Like right now it would be a lot of work, and people don't have a big motivation to build that DAO because they want to build stuff to serve themselves instead.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sam, do you have any thoughts on that and the autonomy, kind of what Ben stated there and where we are?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Ben got it exactly right that like the terms here are fairly hard to define, like decentralized or autonomous. We like throw it around, but it's not fantastically clear what that means, because when you look at it, it really requires you to have an understanding of free will at the base layer, right? Like Ben, you were talking about how you're essentially using a computer right now, and it's not really clear at what level what is controlling what at this point. In my talk, I tried to frame it around machine sovereignty because I thought that was probably the closest we get. It's like this idea that there are entities with rights and that exist unto themselves or work for themselves is perhaps the closest. But on the DAO front, yeah, it's definitely possible to build autonomous DAOs right now. I mean, we founded one for the Arweave community called Arca, using Aragon actually, like 6 months ago, and it works great. And like now it's off, and it has its own governance model, which people like, which I was about to say people are sticking to, but that's not the appropriate phrasing, because it is enforcing upon the people that they stick to it. So it's absolutely possible to get a kind of autonomy now in DAOs for sure. It's very real, in fact. Oh, and to Ben's point about things that seem like fantasy, at least in the world of artificial intelligence, rapidly becoming reality. Yes, 100%. I think a lot of this stuff to people outside of the space that haven't been thinking about it, it seems bizarre and far-fetched, but no, absolutely, this is very real. It's happening very rapidly.
Yeah, Luke, I would love to hear your thoughts, especially coming from Aragon. I know you guys are kind of OGs in the space, so it'd be really interesting to get a sense, I guess maybe even from you, to get a sense of what really what autonomy means, and what being autonomous means as well, just to kind of at least set the groundwork there.
Yeah, I think that the terms are very ill-defined in general. People throw the term DAO around, and they can mean anything from like a glorified multi-sig to like a full like blockchain protocol like Bitcoin. And so there's a large spectrum there, and depending on kind of like the lens that you're looking through and how you measure decentralization and how you measure autonomy, you're going to get things that look and behave very differently. Some things like put human decision making very much like at the center of this thing, and it's probably not going to kind of continue on, and there isn't really any sort of like existential risks about not being able to turn it off. You just stop interacting with it. It may still exist on the blockchain somewhere, but nobody's going to care. But then you look at something closer to like Bitcoin, like Sam was saying earlier, you can't really turn it off. As long as people are participating, even a handful of people, you're still having that like end output and that behavior created in the world. And I think as we see more sophisticated and kind of more complex DAOs, and we see AI be more general and more general purpose, we'll see more DAOs that look like Bitcoin, but for like much broader things than just proof of work mining. So we'll see much more like complex webs of interaction, and we'll have to like face the challenges that like these are fundamentally like self-regulating sovereign entities that impact our world, that we don't really have a good way to regulate.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I'm glad you kind of defined that as well. So I wanted to move and kind of think about how DAOs in this grand vision kind of compete away and actually cut up against this like traditional businesses. So just thinking about the traditional world and what we are familiar with when we think of human coordination, when we think of traditional businesses, do we think that Collective here as a group that AI managed DAOs like could compete away traditional businesses if all they have to do is really pay for gas? The cost of operation is going to diminish quite a bit. So I'd be curious to know, once this world kind of emerges, how it actually will look and how it would bleed up against traditional business. I'm happy. It'd be curious to know what you think here, Sam, since you've obviously discussed the implications. But how this is definitely an implication, right? If they could compete away traditional business, I don't know if you thought anything about that.
For sure. I mean, that's definitely possible. Like a DAO at a fundamental level, particularly when it's on Ethereum, it's something as flexible as like Aragon, at least where I think Aragon is trying to go. It's just like programmable organizational structures. So programmable governance for groups of people. This is very flexible. It can definitely compete with existing businesses. I guess my personal question, curiosity, concern, or like, again, I don't know if this is a truly terrible thing, but it is something I think that we should be thinking carefully about. Is like, but who is it going to work for in the first place? Like, what is it trying to optimize? Is it sovereign? No, but really, that is the question. Like,
I mean, who does General Motors work for in the first place?
Right. I'm not saying that's necessarily better, but it's just like it at least works for a human. And I guess the question that we've got to like wrap our heads around as a society, ideally before this happens, before it ends up like it's on top of us and then we have to react rather than being preemptive, is like, what are we okay with here? What are the legal structures going to be? Can you take a DAO to court? and so on. Like, really, there's a lot of fundamental questions here. And I think it does come back to this idea at some point of sovereignty or autonomy and ultimate beneficial owners, if owner can even be used appropriately in this context.
Yeah, I just to chime in there, I think this might be a surprising response coming from somebody at Aragon, because we've sort of been building a framework around DAOs that allows you to create like really like arbitrary organizational structures. And the beginning of the Aragon project was actually kind of mapping kind of more traditional structures to blockchain structures. I think there's quite a bit of like use for that, and especially when they're like paired with legal structures. So we've seen somebody or some people in the DAO space start to map like legal structures to these quote unquote DAO structures, but really they're just company structures that have been augmented with smart contracts and automated some functions. But I think the potential for DAOs is actually not to compete with firms, but actually to compete with markets. So like a DAO creates a like self-regulating market. Firms can interact with that DAO, whether the firm is an AI agent, an individual person, that can kind of depend. And so like the parallel I see when we're designing or building DAOs is more around like market design, mechanism design, and the responsibility as we get to those types of structures is sort of like a new engineering discipline, where you want to like be very clear about the structures and like the emerging complexities of these interactions, so that you can guarantee that the specific behaviors that you're designing for are going to kind of exist in the long term. Because once it's like launched, it's like launching a satellite. You're not going to be able to touch it for a long period of time. So you have to make sure you get it right up front.
Yeah, I mean, we've thought about SingularityNet as sort of a meta marketplace. Like it's a framework that you could use to create many different AI marketplaces, and then the whole decentralized network of decentralized networks with different blockchain-based AI protocols, that then becomes like a meta marketplace or something, right? So I mean, we are looking at different ways of organizing economic activity, and I wouldn't say that these necessarily serve humans less than a traditional corporation, because I mean, I often think of traditional large corporations. I mean, these are sort of organizational viruses on human society, which don't necessarily, I mean, a large corporation doesn't necessarily do what any one person wants, nor serve any particular group of people especially well. It's a set of protocols by which people are interacting with each other, and which is evolving in this self-organizing way. And in a sense, corporations now have a large aspect of being decentralized, autonomous organizations. I mean, every human is dispensable. The CEO is dispensable. The board will rotate. The employees are certainly dispensable. The shareholders rotate, but the organization remains, right? So I think what we are looking at here potentially are more efficient and intelligent modes of organization of computation and material activity. So I think absolutely, decentralized autonomous organizations can be more effective and outcompete corporations and other older, less flexible and sophisticated modes of organization. I wouldn't think about this primarily as being about lower cost, because the cost of hiring a few humans to do legwork or hiring a few humans to be administrators, that may not be a large part of the cost of operating the DAO. It's more about, is the control mechanism, the decentralized self-organizing control mechanism of a DAO, is it intrinsically better at making decisions? Is it better at adapting as a sort of digital organism to the rapid changes in the business environment and society? And I do think that ultimately, the right DAOs can be more flexible and adaptive in changing and foreseeing what's going to happen in a rapidly evolving world, and then they can outcompete more traditional modes of organization. And of course, there's complex ethical issues there. There's also complex ethical issues about current corporations, right? So, but I do think that transition can happen.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Sam, I see you like thinking a little bit about what Ben is saying here. Ben, you've made a lot of very interesting, salient points here. Sam, I wasn't sure if you wanted to respond to any of that. It seems like you did, but.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess the idea that like a modern corporation could be compared to a DAO is kind of true, in the sense that it's an organization, right? And we created a legal system, an off-chain legal system. And really all we're trying to do with DAOs on-chain is create smart contracts, literally, right? So they're just contracts, but they run in a sort of autonomous way, or at least an automatic way is a fair way to put it. So in that regard, definitely, it's not just that these things will compete with corporations, so they could also have just as many of the flaws as corporations. But I think personally, what I find really interesting about DAOs is that we can get really creative with the structure very easily. You just program them. It's easier than writing legal contracts, and it is more efficient in the sense that it executes automatically, and it's more reliable because it actually executes automatically. There is no human that is trusted to do that execution. But I also think you're right that it's not like cost savings that are the big deal here. I think it's that we can get way more creative about the way we design the organizations in a rapid manner. And yeah, to the point that you made in your talk, the inclusion of AI inside these systems as, say, members in a DAO is super interesting. Like, there's a lot of cool places that can go. And I can kind of see the point that, like, instead of getting one, as you put it, I think, one group of hackers together producing one like output that is the AGI, instead we might actually first see it as a decentralized, not necessarily connected group that are organizing through some kind of DAO-like structure, or at least a protocol structure, right? If they're able to talk to each other in a shared language, I think that's a pretty good start.
Definitely. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess that segues into the point you made a bit about that stamp collector analogy in your presentation, Sam. I'm really curious to hear, Ben, your response there, and Luke, your input there as well, as what the potential for these DAOs and this vision can go. So could DAOs become so monopolistic that they're programmed, exclusively to maximize profits? Is that what that would mean? How do you control that? Obviously, some of the fear, Sam, is that this will just, be so autonomous that the human control there would no longer be relevant. But Ben, I'm kind of on that point alone. I'm kind of curious.
Well, I think it is possible to build a wide variety of AI systems, and one could certainly build obsessive compulsive, psychopathic, and sociopathic reinforcement learning system whose only goal was to maximize the number of Donald Trump icons in the universe, and then proceed to transform all matter in the universe into images of Donald Trump's beautiful smiling face. I think human beings are not simplistic goal-achieving systems of that nature. I mean, we are what I would call open-ended intelligences, and I would encourage people to look up the PhD thesis of my friend David Weinbaum called Open-Ended Intelligence, and he tries to explore a different perspective on intelligence. Not an intelligence as something with a certain set of goals that is then trying to choose actions to optimize these goals at all costs, which is one way of looking at intelligence. It's often convenient from a programming point of view, but more looking at an intelligence as a complex self-organizing system, which is generating new patterns internally and in conjunction with its environment and expanding its boundaries through its self-organizing, self-understanding activity. So if you look at a DAO or a human being or an AGI system as an open-ended intelligence rather than as a reinforcement learning driven goal optimizer, I mean, the argument that tiling the universe with Donald Trumps or maximizing your stamp collection is a likely thing to happen. It just starts to seem very, very silly. Now, what's not silly, on the other hand, is the notion that building AI systems that are fundamentally more generally intelligent than we are has an irreducible uncertainty and risk to it, right? Like my dog cannot predict what I'm going to do tomorrow. He doesn't understand that when I'm sitting here, waving around my arms and talking at my computer, that I'm talking to other people that are far across the world. He just thinks I'm an idiot yelling at my computer, right? So, I mean, if you're creating things that are fundamentally more intelligent than people, or equally or even less intelligent, but in a very different way than humans are intelligent, we can't predict what's going to happen. And this is this is the reality. And there's some notion that if we pontificate about ethics long enough and think about it, we're going to be able to predict what's going to happen. But I'm less certain that's ever going to be the case. And it's also clear, for example, Vladimir Putin has said whoever gets to AGI first is essentially going to be the most powerful in the world. And Xi Jinping is putting huge amount of effort into AI development. So if some of us decide to stop and pontificate about stamp collection instead of building AGI, not everyone else in the world is doing that. In fact, many actors with great amount of resources are pushing as fast as they can toward AGI specifically because of the large amount of practical benefit that it can bring. So, I mean, my view is that there are certainly risks there. These particular risks framed in terms of reinforcement learning and stamp collecting, I think, are irrelevant and silly. But overall, there are large risks, there are large opportunities, and we're navigating in a very amazing, exciting, dangerous, and confusing domain, which humanity has been doing since we stopped being cave people. Basically, we've been plunging into completely unknowable and confusing situations and trying to make the best of them.
Okay, can I respond to that, please? so obviously the stamp collector, no one's going to make a stamp collecting optimizing AI first. That's not likely. However, I think the concern, and I also agree that in the final position that we get to, we're more likely to end up at something that is benevolent. But the concern is actually what you brought up at the start of when you were speaking, which is like, it's easy from a programmer's perspective to see it as the AI should optimize towards one goal. And when we're starting out in the opening phases, that is what the programmers will do because that is what is easy. And that's where the concern lies. So yes, I think that like the eventual conclusion, and the best research I've seen in this space basically says, okay, well, we can just program another neural network, or CNN, whatever it happens to be, to understand human moral behavior, and then have that as a regulating mechanism on top of the AGI. Like, that's a system that you can kind of half believe would have the effect that we need. But the problem is, what's going to happen first? And I'm not saying we should sit around pontificating, because yes, I think it would be much worse if Xi Jinping got there before at least like OpenAI or some group like this. But I think that we do need to address these concerns. Like, these are not fabricated. This is very real.
No, my
yes,
pushback
it is a case of, I guess,
wasn't just on stamp
timing.
collecting, but on sort of expected reward maximization as a way of thinking about what an AI is doing, which I think does have some pathologies associated with it, but isn't. I mean, not every AI has to be an expected reward maximizer, right?
So I think it's going to depend, right? Like, it'll just be what we program it to be first. And I think the danger is the reward maximization is the obvious, easy answer to, okay, we've got an AGI, but like, it's got to do something. So how do we tell it what to do? Well, we give it some kind of objective function to maximize. And I guess the concern stems from the fact that even though we can understand what better mechanisms for that might look like later, the ones that people are actually going to implement first, because it's faster and it's simpler, and as you correctly identify, there's now enormous amounts of resources being pushed into trying to get there first, trying to be the first. We're likely to cut this corner.
So now we're getting to subtler, we're getting to subtler points, because I mean, of course, I have my own AGI project out of the sort of OpenCog neural symbolic AI system, which specifically it's not reinforcement learning based, and it's not deep learning based. And my guess is that expected reward maximization is not only ethically dangerous, but it's not actually the right way to get to AGI. So that there are tricky questions here in terms of which path is going to bring you to AGI first, and then what are the sort of ethical and goal system properties of that path that gets there first. And objectively, like, none of us knows which path is going to get there first, whether it's the one that an OpenAI and DeepMind are taking now, whether it's a different path my own team is taking now, or something else that nobody has thought of yet. And that could make a difference, right? Depending on how you get there first, and also depending on whether it's something one team programmed, or whether it's actually a collective activity of things that different people program based on different AI paradigms. Like how AGI is achieved is obviously gonna impact how the next stage of evolution post the emergence of human level AGI happens. And we have a pretty sketchy understanding of how this is gonna unfold.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we could talk about this all day, but yeah.
Yeah, if you have something to say, please. If not, I was going to ask Luke, as the Aragon arbitrator here, to give his thoughts before we jump into the Q&A here.
Yeah, well, I actually kind of have a follow-up question there. So like that topic kind of dove into the dangers of AGI and the race for AGI, but kind of at the intersection of DAOs and AI, maybe there are like more imminent dangers even with narrow AI. Like if we create these incentive systems that encourage certain behaviors, even in a very narrow scope, the ramifications of that could be very damaging. Like the impact of Bitcoin mining on the environment is like just a simple example, but as these things get more complex, but like still relatively narrow, like not this like idea of inventing AGI, but actually just with like deep learning and machine learning, data marketplaces and privacy. We may see very dangerous like emergent behaviors at that intersection that we struggle to regulate even before we hit AGI.
Yeah, for sure. Like this is what I was trying to say in my second to last slide or something. It was like, okay, so we don't have to wait for AGI to be a concern. You know, we see the DeFi space right now is full of hacks, and there are lots of people. There are lots of channels where you can go and watch people analyze the transactions that people are making that are abusing, you know, these like zero length loans. So you can take a flash loan that says I can just get arbitrary amounts of money, and as long as I return it by the end of the transaction, I don't have to pay a fee, and I can use this to abuse lots and lots of DeFi applications on Ethereum. So this is all really interesting stuff, but you've got to look at this and be like, well, shit. Sorry, if goodness, if we had an AI that was semi good at understanding these opportunities, you could make unbelievable amounts of money, and like this is really not so hard to believe that it'll happen within the next few years or so. And then comes the question, okay, so who is that AI going to work for? You might expect, I was about to say hope. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the right word. You might expect that the designer of this system would make it so that the ETH can be extracted from this machine at some point, and they can take it, and it basically is just out there trying to farm money for them. That's great. That's one outcome. Well, I mean, is it great? That's another question. That's an outcome. Another outcome is that they just decide that actually they should just let the ETH sit there. Like there is no withdrawal system. And if they do that, then, you know, like I outlined it, I think we can see if the AI is sufficiently good, we end up with deflationary effects. And this really isn't so far around the corner. And this is definitely like a goal optimization AI program. This is very simple. This is nothing to do with AGI. This is just like hackers playing around for fun tomorrow, if they wanted to, could completely achieve this.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that the default progress of AI right now is the control of all data on the planet and almost all processing power on the planet by narrow AI systems created by a few large tech companies, mostly in US and China, and a few large governments, right? So these centralized forces of nation states and big tech companies are sucking everyone's data in. They're buying all the hardware. They're hiring all the AI PhDs. They're processing this with AI with a view toward what? Toward advancing the sovereignty of their particular nation states over other nation states, or toward maximizing shareholder value of corporations by, for example, making people look at news articles they don't care about and click on links to buy shit they don't need, right? So I mean that's the default. That's the world economy without decentralized networks. So it's rampant abuse of computing technology and psychology and narrow AI technology all mixed up together. Now, of course, decentralization and DAOs are not a magic bullet that can only be used for good, right? I mean, decentralization is just not being centralized. You could have a malevolent decentralized network, or you could have a benevolent decentralized network. And the worst possible decentralized network is probably much worse than the centralized system we have now, right? But with decentralized networks, you have the flexibility to architect a lot of different things, including a lot of different things that can seed automated creation of other things. And in that design and evolution space, there's certainly many things that are much more beneficial than the mode of organization we have now. But of course, I mean, yeah, in hacking, there can be AI DAO botnets that are tremendously more effective than the current botnets.
Called Monero.
Hacking, stealing everyone's money and spamming everyone with random nonsense. You could imagine, you know, a DAO surveillance network that tried to compete with imagine a DAO surveillance network that was a botnet and just went around on everyone's device, put worms and viruses in there, spied on everything you're doing, analyzed what it was, and then announced it to everyone to embarrass you, right? Or there's an insane number of strange, malevolent possibilities that could be created, and humanity being what it is, many of them probably will be created, right? I mean, my hope is that the benevolent applications outweigh the malevolent ones, and I think human history gives us some reason to be hopeful there, because I mean, right now we could have a lot more nasty stuff going on with synthetic biology and computer viruses and all sorts of nasty things than what we have on the planet now, because by and large there's a lot more people working on beneficial applications than on like destroying humanity. You know, there's even more people working on selfish type applications, as we see in large corporations. So it's certainly an unruly mix, and there's tremendous risks as well as opportunities even before we get to the AGI stage, and all these are setting the stage on which the AGI will emerge.
That's fair. Things could always be worse, I guess.
well, that's a different point. Yeah, I mean, you could have a neural computer virus that goes into our brains and mind uploads us into a virtual world simulation of the Christian hell until the end of the universe. we could have a lot of worse things. Yeah.
I think, but the fundamental question here is it's all about timing, and that this stuff we were experimenting with before, like we've experimented with these kinds of things before. Like we made nuclear bombs. Okay, so that was a level of technological advancement that if we got it wrong, that could have gone very, very badly wrong. So it's not like this level of society destroying risk is new. It's just we're again on the cusp of one of those things that if we made a significant error at this point in time, the effect could be the end of us all, I guess.
But this is different. The comparison with nukes is interesting because you don't need uranium isotopes of a rare variety.
I know.
To create AGI, right? So,
right.
And we're barely controlling nuclear materials now, even given that. Like there's brief cases of rogue nukes roaming around Central Asia. But I mean, AI, all you need is knowledge, which is increasingly prevalent, and computer hardware, which is increasingly prevalent. So, I mean, that's where we get to the conclusion you presented. Like, you know, once the technology is there, we're not going to control this. I mean, there's no Geiger counter for whether there's an AI program on your laptop, right? So that's
yeah. And I think it's, you know, once we get to AGI, like I think that AGI is sufficiently far away from where we are now that like no basement dwelling hacker, as Trump once put it, I think, weighing 400 pounds or whatever he said, is going to just magically make AGI one day. It's not going to work like that. But as soon as AGI is generally available, you can fit it together on top of a blockchain exceptionally easily, and then you have this conclusion that I came to regarding decentralized AI. And the likelihood we're going to be able to make sure that everybody is, however we want to talk about the reward system, whatever it should be optimizing for, the likelihood that every single instance is going to be optimizing for something that is beneficial for society is almost zero, I would say.
I mean, the thing is, it looks to you like AGI is far away, but I remember when people thought the internet was decades away, and the Human Genome Project was completely fanciful. So it is hard, right? Like it's true. Someone's not going to take, you know, some TensorFlow script and train it on some video data of people romping around and an AGI pops out. There are genuine advances that are needed. On the other hand, you know, a team of very bright people working at the edge of research, working for a few years, can make outstanding breakthroughs. So it's not obvious to me that we couldn't be a few years away from the emergence of artificial general intelligence, whether it's my team that does it or OpenAI, DeepMind, a team in China, or someone else. I mean, it's not obvious that we are only a few years away either. It's just that there have been tremendous breakthroughs that almost all the experts in the field said were not going to happen anytime soon,
For sure.
including in AI. Like self-driving cars was amazing
Yeah.
to see. In 2010, everyone was like, "Oh, self-driving cars are hundreds of years away, complete fantasy." Then by 2015, everyone's like, "Well, it's obvious this is just an engineering problem, and we're going to get there. We're going to get there pretty soon." So we've seen that again and again and again. And so if AGI does emerge more rapidly than that, then these questions all become quite acute in terms of what's the dynamics, what's the control mechanism that's involved. And I mean that's why some of us working at the intersection of AI and blockchain think it's so important to be creating these tools that enable decentralization to even be part of the picture. Like if someone does create AGI, be it me or someone else, in like 3 years or 5 years from now, is the only way to deploy it on a massive centralized server farm, or is there even an option to have it be something that's more decentralized and self-organizing? And what's being created in the decentralized AI and blockchain space is at least the tool set that lets decentralized organization be part of the picture. And I mean, the whole legal structure around DAOs is another part of that. Like at least the infrastructure is being laid, so there's a wider palette of options.
Okay, so the first part that you were talking about, I totally agree with. Like, I think GPT-3 building on top of GPT-2 is like a really obvious example of this. And GPT-3 does math, and they didn't mean to teach it math. That's amazing. That's very clearly multi-domain intelligence. And you can also get GPT-2, that people played around with this, to like generate pictures of Pokemon. So if you take like some Pokemon PNGs and you turn them into a kind of text form, you can train it on that set and it will generate you things that kind of look like Pokemon. Yeah. Like, it's very clear that these models have broken out of the single domain. It's not clear yet whether you can call them general. But I think what we're basically seeing, and maybe the most alarming part of this, is that the only real difference between GPT-2 and GPT-3 is it's just like 100 times bigger. Same model, same idea, nothing technically very different. It's just way bigger, way more compute. They trained it with $12 million worth of compute, which I think is like one of the things that stops our 400-pound hacker getting involved. But anyway, so that's one part of it. But the second part, I think, and I'm pro decentralization of almost everything. However, in this particular case, I don't know that as soon as we make AGI, I want it to be immediately decentralized. And I think this is where the fundamental disagreement between you and I is. Because as far as I can tell, until we understand how it works and how it's, let's call them systems of benevolence, like who it works for, what it's trying to optimize for, until this is all sorted, I don't want to have an AI where I don't have an off switch. Like I actually think that the off switch at this point is a feature, not a button.
You're using the word "I" there. Yeah, if you have the off switch, you'll like it. But if some other has the off switch, then that may depend on how much you like that guy. This comes back to Winston Churchill's view that like democracy is the worst possible form of government, except for all the other ones, right? So I mean, it's not a fictitious entity that's creating this AGI. Like it's say the Russian government, or it's Microsoft or Amazon with their humongous server farms in Crystal City right next to the Pentagon. I mean, so the question is, do you want one of these centralized entities controlling an early stage AGI for their own ends, or do you want a decentralized network guiding that AGI? And then to me, that comes down, how is that decentralized network defined and designed? Because unless I am the world potentate and dictator, like I'm not the guy having the off switch. In the US, it will be Donald Trump having the off switch. I'd rather have a decentralized network than Donald Trump having the off switch.
But I think this is slightly conflating the issues, because there's like, yes, I would prefer benevolent AI that everyone had access, AGI that everyone had access to at the same point in time and could ask things of. And that should be decentralized for sure. That's great. Like, I don't want it to be so that you could turn off that system, or make it private for that matter. However, that shouldn't be conflated with the idea that, like, okay, Putin's AGI should not be decentralized to start with. Putin's AGI, I'm sure we can all
Putin
agree.
will not be decentralized to start with. But I think we're okay.
Right, but it's a in that environment, the off switch is a feature, not a bug. And I think we're both actually in agreement that, or maybe, I don't know, that most likely it's going to be like the first shimmers of AGI are going to emerge in those environments. And so, well, I think we at least broadly understand each other. I'm not sure we quite agree. However, we could have this conversation literally all day. I think there was supposed to be are we opening up for questions or?
Yeah, I wanted to get that. Luke, if you wanted anything to add there, feel free, but I'm going to jump into the Q&A. So just make sure.
Let's jump into it.
Okay, cool. Okay, so first question that we have here is, what is your view on the concept of swarm AI? Is it a candidate for DAO? Any opinions here?
That seems like a Ben place.
Oh.
Yeah,
I mean, swarm AI is not an incredibly well-defined term either. So, I mean, yes, certainly one could create a DAO whose bylaws and purpose was to foster a swarm AI, and there could be different DAOs manifesting different sorts of AI algorithms which could all coexist in the world. So yeah.
Great.
Like your explanation earlier of maybe a DAO of narrow AGI or AIs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could do it, right? I mean, you could have a DAO where the nodes in the DAO were very, very simple learning or adaptive agents, where almost all the intelligence was on the emergent level. Or you could have a DAO where the components were each pretty smart, sophisticated, distributed systems themselves that were sharing knowledge with each other. And you could have a mix of that within a single DAO or multiple DAOs, some of which had more granular components than others, all interacting with each other. And when you get emergent dynamics on that level that the programmers didn't create, then like the internet is being your artificial life laboratory, right? Which is exciting and dangerous and weird. But of course, right now the internet is a laboratory for corporate and government programming of human psychology and behavior, which is also weird and scary. So there's a lot of things that are going to be layered on top of each other here.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Definitely. So there's a follow-up question, or well, unrelated to that prior question, but so I don't know how many of you guys listened to the Radiolab program, but there was a Radiolab program, Decoding the Void, suggesting that consciousness is an emergent property from parts of the brain talking to each other. Is that perhaps a parallel here?
Well, I don't know what Radiolab is, but I mean, I think the nature of consciousness is its own quite complex topic, but I would say human-like consciousness, if we want to set aside the philosophy of qualia and the nature of experience. But the variety of consciousness that, say, humans have a lot more of than earthworms, right? Or rocks. Certainly, that aspect of consciousness does have to do with the coordinated emergent activity among different parts of the brain. And I think one can meaningfully look at a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization of computational components, as having perhaps its own sorts of emergent consciousness. But I would say, since any DAO we're going to build on the internet serving practical functions is going to be very, very different in its composition and dynamics than the human brain, you would imagine the states of consciousness it would enter into are going to be very, very different than human ones. And we barely understand human states of consciousness, let alone states of consciousness of these hypothetical non-human intelligent entities. So it's very interesting. But which of the aspects of human consciousness would carry over to a very different type of self-organizing information system is not very obvious, right? I mean, science hasn't quite gone there yet.
I think like the only other thing to add to that is it's a question of, so if you look at an anthill, right? Anthills, they function as collectives that you could almost see have some kind of consciousness together, not alone, but together. Like an individual ant actually is exceptionally dumb. You don't get the impression looking at it that it's capable of very much. But when a large number of ants are put together in an anthill, they self-organize in a way that does appear to have some kind of consciousness. And I think a kind of DAO is actually very similar to that, particularly if that DAO was made up of, say, narrow AIs, something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting point. So I guess that kind of moves into the next question when you're thinking about, coordination between different pieces and this idea of a decentralized autonomous organization. This question goes to like whether or not, by definition, if it's referencing to formal organizations, which are legal structures, so companies, associations, etc.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think that the crux of this comes from how you define decentralization and autonomy. So a lot of people use the DAO term in the context of blockchains to describe any organization that has like smart contracts defining its logic, and that sort of assumes that because it's built on decentralized infrastructure and it doesn't have like any like built-in sort of regulation or ties to a legal system, it's autonomous. Once it's deployed, it's there forever, and that's sufficient to like make it a decentralized autonomous organization, regardless of how it's structured. The other way to look at it is that the decentralization like measure isn't just the infrastructure, but also how the organization is structured itself. And the autonomous nature has to do with it having built-in incentives for people to interact with it. And so depending on like which lens you look at decentralization and autonomy through, you end up with a definition that describes something that looks very much like a company, and probably like for all intents and purposes from the perspective of the legal system is a company or an unincorporated like partnership. But if you look through that other lens, you start to see things that look more like coordination protocols like Bitcoin or Ethereum or Uniswap that are coordinating a lot of activity. And that the challenge is that definition has two widely different like outputs that look and behave very, very differently depending on how you define those terms.
Totally agree. Yeah, as OpenLaw just released the LAO, which is a LLC wrapper, so on a DAO, so similar to what you're saying. I mean, although if you are coordinating as a group, you kind of want your own limited liability and protection there. Otherwise, if you leave it up to the legal system, you're a general partnership. So you can almost think about the legal and traditional business of setting up a company more as a protection for you yourself rather than really even for coordination. So. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if Ben or Sam, you had anything to add there, but would love to hear from you.
No, you guys pretty much covered it.
Great. Okay, so this also nice segue to the next one. So what about law enforcement on DAOs? How do you send the police against a DAO that does drug trading, for example? I know we talked a little bit about arbitration earlier in the panel, but would love to hear how people feel about law enforcement here.
I think this one's like, the answer is like, no one really knows. Like, we obviously don't have a framework for this. And that's pretty much,
I mean, there's a bunch of different cases, right? So, I mean, you could have a DAO that had a legal formalization underlying it, and we've talked to some European governments. I've been talking to the government of Malta about how to do that. Like, can you create a DAO which is incorporated in Malta as a company, but without a human being being in control of it, like without a human being that you can blame and assign liability for things. And I mean, an analogy there is, say, a child which is a legal citizen, but there's a guardian who is appointed who's supposed to be wiser than them in some way, right? So I mean, you could have a DAO which has some sort of legal autonomy, but there may be some humans who are appointed as guardians in some sense, but they're not necessarily fully responsible for what the DAO does. And there's similar issues there to what responsibility do you have for what your 17-year-old kid does or something, right? So I mean, if they kill someone, you're not put to death, but you do have some responsibility for what they do. So for DAOs that are kind of shoehorned into the legal structure like that, there's some semi-specific answers. Now, for a DAO that's just out there as a protocol with maybe an anonymous author or something, right? I mean, then there may be no one to sue. On the other hand, I mean, of course, it's running on servers, right? So I mean, there is physical infrastructure on which the DAO is operating, and hypothetically, law enforcement could like go into the house and the pocket of everyone who's running a Bitcoin node or something, and say, well, you've got an illegal DAO running on your hardware, as our sniffers have identified, so we're confiscating this hardware, right? I mean, this is not really much more outrageous than them going into your pocket and taking some plant that you're using to affect your state of consciousness and arresting you for it, right? So I mean, this is perfectly feasible. Governments can do that, and maybe they would if a DAO became dangerous enough.
I think
so,
that like. Go on.
Yeah, there's this interesting legal concept that's starting to emerge around actually using sufficient decentralization as sort of a measure. And we saw this in the securities regulation framework when the SEC determined that like Bitcoin and Ethereum weren't securities, and there's starting to be some legal thought around that. And I think it's interesting because if you're not sufficiently decentralized, it's pretty clear how the law would apply, whether you apply it or not, right? Like if you have a DAO that looks like a company, it's a general partnership. If you have a DAO that looks like a protocol, then we have to get into this like much grayer, like unknown territory around whether this is actually like sufficiently decentralized to be treated as such. And then if you do hit that like that measure, what are the implications of that? And I think like we have some examples like blockchain protocols like Ethereum and Bitcoin are there. And the questions of like who's liable, is it like developers of the core protocol? Like where does liability go when you actually reach that that milestone or like that measure of sufficient decentralization? And I think in many cases the answer is that it goes to the edges. So like if we have this DAO that has like automation at the center and like humans or machines or whatever at the edges, then it's the individuals interacting at the edges that probably should be held liable, even if that ends up being much more difficult to enforce.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically what happened with the internet, right? Like, we made protocols. People use those protocols for good things. People use protocols for bad things. But Tim Berners-Lee does not have his door kicked down by the police every time someone sells drugs using HTTP, right? At least that's how it's played out so far. I think there is a really interesting question about like, when we get protocols that are themselves intelligent or that are, they don't even have to be intelligent, but they have to be making choices in the world on their own without a human behind it pushing them, or at least one human. So like a DAO or like a decentralized AI. Yeah, then I think the natural response by governments when it gets serious enough is going to be the kind of knocking your door and say, hey, don't you run that Ethereum node? But I don't think it's going to be effective. Like the incentives are too strong, just as I was talking about in my talk with Maurice, this guy in Canada who did some pretty terrible things to, well, yeah, it's a long story, but like the incentives in these systems can be extremely strong. People are motivated in such a way that I think that it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to get everyone to shut down their Ethereum nodes, for example. I think it's what governments will try, and I think it will fail. What happens after that is a big question mark.
Great. Yeah. I think the key there is sufficient decentralization, right? So moving on. So could using a network of narrow AIs to create an AGI system on the blockchain make the system attackable by narrow AI injection?
define narrow AI injection? Does anyone else get that?
I'm
Okay.
I mean, could an AGI be hacked and taken over by a narrow AI? I mean, of course it could. Like a human body can be hacked by injection of a virus, which is much simpler than the human body, right? So I mean, cybersecurity is. I mean, there's a vague analogy between cybersecurity of a DAO and immunology of a biological organism, right? And the human immune system is a learning system, and any DAO that has a lot of resources behind it and that is intelligent and adaptive is going to end up putting some of those resources toward defending itself against attackers who want to take those resources. So that certainly is going to happen, and I mean, we can't foresee exactly what form it will take, but I mean, the answer is yes. I guess it is attackable, and it will try to defend itself, and that's how it goes.
Right. I think like the whole idea is the AGI should be smarter than the AI, and it should be able to recognize the attack and respond.
But you should be smarter than a virus and should be able to defeat it. But,
True.
But that doesn't always
but the body isn't very intelligent. The mind is intelligent, but the body is pretty stupid.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know.
Well, and if you want to take that analogy, many high IQ people have been absorbed into cults and succumbed to various mental viruses.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
That's a great analogy, actually. So, yeah.
The narrow AI cult.
Yeah. So this is the last question, just to wrap things up. I don't know how many of you guys have watched the HBO show Silicon Valley. It's pretty funny, but I think the last question here is, how do you see the blockchain story in the HBO show Silicon Valley?
I've not seen the last season.
I haven't.
For a while, it was kind of funny because we would watch it, and then we, as a company, like the core people, and we'd be like, oh, look, I remember when that one happened. Like we had an investor once that was very close to the guy with the not this, with the doors in the car, and a couple of other storylines like that. We're very relatable, but I haven't seen the end of it, so who knows?
Has anyone else seen that? No.
I've seen it. I'm trying to remember all the specifics of the the blockchain story. I know that they were trying to create a new internet, and they had this miracle compression algorithm that just made everything
right.
Magically scale. I would love to see that in the blockchain space. Just scalability solved.
Magic scalability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Double out compression.
Right. And it was something about 3D video was the key thing at some TechCrunch Disrupt show. And it wasn't very believable, that part, but some parts were pretty close to life.
Yeah, we'll see how the blockchain storyline develops. Maybe I should catch this last season because I did not even know that happened. So I guess that's our last question on this panel. Thank you guys so much for participating. If there's any last words here, if you want to leave on a note, feel free. Don't know if you guys have any last words, but thank you so much.
Thank you. The debate was super fun. It was very enjoyable. Yeah.
Really cool topic. Thanks.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.